Okay. So today we're going to be taking a look at we're going to be taking everything we've learned so far and actually building a useful end-to-end application with it. We'll also be learning some concepts from a framework called Next.js, which if you haven't heard of Next, what's up, Sully? If you haven't heard of Next, that lets you take React and TypeScript and build full stack applications. Today's workshop is going to be a bit more interactive. We're actually going to go through the steps of building an application in a way that mimics the actual workflows in Hack for Impact dev teams. So I recommend just paying attention today. But if you want to watch the video and follow along at home, we are going to be working out of the Web Dev Workshop SP24 repo in the 6 folder. And if you don't see that, make sure you do a git pull so that you get the most recent changes. Okay, so before we actually dive in and start working, first we have to ensure that our problem is well defined. So let's go ahead and open up our problem here. The problem is that you are a developer for Hack for Impact. You are on a team that's building a project for Not a Real Co., a nonprofit that hosts volunteering events around Knoxville. They need a new volunteer management system that can keep track of volunteers, and they need to store the following information about a given volunteer: their full name, email, phone number, address, number of events attended. They will use this information as a record and would like to be able to see a list of all of their volunteers. And the address is going to be optional. So what I want you guys to do is you three get together and take 5 minutes to talk about what you think the database schema should look like for this application. All right, I'll give you 5 minutes now. I'm going to pause the recording. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about what I came up with. I think we're going to want a single collection that contains volunteers. And in that collection, for each volunteer, we're going to store their first name, last name, email, phone, which are all strings, and then number of events. Num events is what I called it. And that's a number, and then an optional address field, right? So yeah, so great job. You guys nailed it. So let's go ahead and build that. Regardless, it's a team effort. You guys did great. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and build that. I'll start by first creating the TypeScript type for the volunteer. I'm gonna do that in the source types data model folder. I'm gonna create a new file and call that volunteer.ts. And then in here, I'm gonna define what a volunteer will look like for TypeScript. So just like we talked about, we're gonna do export interface volunteer. First name is going to be a string. Last name is going to be a string. Email is going to be a string. Phone is going to be a string. Address is going to be an optional string. And num events is going to be a number. Sweet. So now we have our TypeScript type. We'll also create another type for this, and this is going to be more closely representative of the data that's actually stored in the database. At Hack for Impact, we call these entity types. The reason we call them that is just because it's like a database entity. It's what actually lives in the database. So we want a type to represent what that's going to look like when we get something from the database. So to do that, we'll do export interface volunteer entity. And then I'm going to use the extends keyword to say it's going to have all of the fields that the volunteer has with some extra stuff. And that extra field is just going to be an underscore ID, because again, we're working with Mongo, so that's going to come back with an underscore ID. And that's it. So this type right here will have all of this stuff and then also an ID on it. Okay.
Could you repeat that entity thing again?
Yeah, so the point of this kind of entity type is so that we have a type in our code that represents exactly what's going to be in the database, right? So in the database, we're going to be storing a first name, last name, email, phone, address, and the number of events. But we're also going to have an ID. Each volunteer is going to have an ID. So we want to create a type that has that ID without saying that the volunteer has an ID on it. Because when you think about a volunteer, you just want the information that the volunteer is going to have, not necessarily like the ID, which is more of a implementation detail that lets Mongo identify it. Does that make sense?
So like, that's just specifically for the database and everything else.
Yeah, and the volunteer, sorry?
So like the volunteer stuff is like in the database, but not like used by mongoose. That would.
Right, yeah. So the volunteer just represents what a volunteer looks like, all the data that's in a volunteer. But then this volunteer entity has extra fields on it that the database puts in there. So we don't want to put that in our volunteer type because that's
It's
we're
an internal one.
yeah, exactly. Thank you. It's an
Another
internal
example of
reference.
What could be an entity, sometimes there's like created at or updated that field that's in the database, so you can see when something was created or edited. That would be another thing that's not relevant to a volunteer, but it's in the database, so it'd be in the volunteer.
Yes. Does that make sense, Andy?
Yeah.
Okay.
Good question.
Yeah, good question. Okay. So now that we have these types, we can actually build our schema. Similarly to the Mongo workshop 2 weeks ago, I'll do this in a file in the server models, and I'll create a file called volunteer.ts. And then in here, we're going to define a schema just like we saw 2 weeks ago. So we'll say const volunteer schema equals new schema from Mongoose. And then inside of this schema, inside of the parentheses, we actually define what this schema is going to look like. So what data is going to be stored in this database. So first we'll want first name. And then in here, inside of these curly braces, we put some information about the first name. So first we're going to say its type. Its type is going to be a string. Why is this not going away? Okay. Its type is going to be a string. And then also this is required, right? We're requiring that you have a first name. So we'll say required true. And also I'm going to turn off Copilot because I don't want spoilers. Okay. Then we'll do the same with last name. Type string required true. And then again, same thing with email. Type string required true. Whoa. And then we'll do the same with the phone. Again, just type string required true. And then we take our address. Oh, we're getting crazy now. This one's going to be different. Type string required false. And then we'll do num events. Type string, and I'm going to say required false here, but give it a default value. So you remember 2 weeks ago, if you remember, we talked about how you can like give a schema a default value so that like if I tried to create a volunteer in the database without supplying num events, it's just going to default it to 0, right? Sorry. Oh, yeah, type number. Whoops. Cool. And so then we have to add some boilerplate at the bottom to get this working. I'm going to just copy and paste this. I explained it last week or 2 weeks ago. So if you need a refresher on what this code is going to do, go ahead and look at the lesson from 2 weeks ago. It's on YouTube. And oh, I forgot to import this. Yeah. And then you'll see we're actually using that volunteer entity here. So that's why we needed that. Okay. So we feeling good so far? Cool. So now we have a model that can interact with our database. Now we'll need to create some functions that can perform specific actions. Specifically, we'll create 2 functions, one to get all volunteers and another to create a volunteer. And so again, similar to 2 weeks ago lesson, I'm going to create this in the server/actions folder. I'm going to call it volunteer.ts. And first, we'll start with the function to get all volunteers. And I don't know how to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask ChatGPT, aka the expert. Let's see what, spoilers. Let's see what ChatGPT has to say. And one caveat I'll say here, ChatGPT is a resource that you can use, and I highly recommend you use it, but make absolutely sure that you understand what the code that it spits out is doing and why it's doing that. A lot of times it'll write code that is more complicated than it needs to be. So, and usually it can't know about the broader context of your project. I think it's a great resource for things like this. Like, hey, I don't know how to create or get all volunteers from a database. So let me just ask ChatGPT. It spits out a function. I'm like, okay, cool. So let's go ahead and ask it, how can I get all documents from a collection in Mongoose? And if that verbiage confuses you, wordage confuses you, whatever, check out the lesson from 2 weeks ago. We went over all these terms in there. Okay, so I'll ask it. Okay, to retrieve all documents from a collection in Mongoose, you use the find method without passing any filter criteria to it. Okay, so let's see what it's spitting out here. Okay, so the important thing I want to look at here is you use the find method and then you don't pass anything to it. Okay, sweet. So now I know how to do that. Let's go ahead and write this function, async function. Well, we have to export it, export async function, function, get all volunteers. And then in here, again, a couple weeks ago, we talked about how you need to make sure you're connected to your database. So every Hack for Impact project has this DB connect function. So you'll call await DB connect. And that'll make sure the database you have connected to the database. Then after that, we will say const volunteers, and we'll give that a type of volunteer entity array equals volunteer dot find. And then we don't pass anything to it. And so that's going to get all of the volunteers in our database. Then we can go ahead and just return those volunteers. Okay. Why is that mad at me? Oh, I need to await that call because that is an asynchronous call. And there we go. Okay.
Do you not call it volunteer schema?
So that's that function. Next, we'll try and create a function that can create a volunteer. And again, I don't know how to do that either. So let's hit a quick Goog for that one. Instead of using ChatGPT this time, I'm just going to Google, I don't know, like Mongoose create document or something. And then I'll click this here. Okay. It's got some docs right here. Whoa, that's a lot of stuff. Don't care to read all that. Let me look at some other options. This one looks nice. It's talking about just this create function. Okay, let's look at this. So it looks like we do our model.create. So we'll do volunteer.create. If we look down at the code here, in that create function, we pass in the data that we actually want to put into the database. So sweet. Let's go ahead and implement that function given that knowledge. So again, we'll do export async function create volunteer. And we'll say volunteer. We're going to pass in a volunteer to this function, the one that we're trying to create. This is going to be of type volunteer. And then all I need to do in here, I need to again await DB connect, make sure I'm connected. And then I can do volunteer dot, wait, why is that? Okay, why'd that import twice? Oh, we'll say as I volunteer. Okay. Then we'll say volunteer.create with our volunteer parameter, and I'll await that as well. And let me come up here and delete that line.
Questions as to how either of these functions operate or what they do?
Okay, cool. So that's looking good, but there is one thing I want to change about this function. Currently, we could create a volunteer with however many events we want. So someone could go in here, create a volunteer with like 80 events, and then it's like that volunteer is volunteered at 80 events when really they haven't, right? So we want to make sure you can't do that. And the reason we can do that is if we look at this type here that it's expecting a num events to be passed in, right? So I want to make sure that when you're creating a volunteer, you actually can't supply a num events. That should automatically be set to 0. So what I'll do is I'll create a new type called create volunteer. I'll create a new type, export type, create volunteer request. and I'll set that equal to this TypeScript type called omit, which will take in a type and a field, and it'll remove that type from that field. Well, what does that mean? Let's take a look. So we'll do volunteer, and we'll omit num events. And if I hover over it, you can see that we have the exact same type as the volunteer, except this one has no num events on it, right? So then we can come into our action and we can change this. Instead of I volunteer, we'll make this a create volunteer request. And I can delete that. Sweet. And so now my users can't pass in a fake number of events that some volunteers attended. It's going to just start at 0. And then as they go to events, that's when you'll increase that number, right? All right. So any questions about anything we've gone over? All right. We're looking good. But if you remember, oh no, did I lose it? There it is. But if we remember from this diagram last week, we have the database and server parts set up, but we still need to do this API part. And before we do this, so we're going to do this using the Next.js. But before we do this, I want to take a brief moment to talk about Next.js and how its quote unquote path-based routing system works. And so before we can understand what path-based routing is, we need to understand what routing is, okay? So to explain this, I will use an example. Let's take a look at one of the best websites on the internet, xaviermiller.com. And when I go to this website, you'll see that in this navigation bar up here, we have 3 places that we can go to. We can go to projects, we can go to journal, or we can go to about. If I click on one of these links, I'll be taken to a new page, right? So pay attention to the URL up here as I click on this projects page. If you saw the URL, you see we now have /projects on the end of it. This is a route. The /projects bit at the end of the URL tells my website, hey, I want to see the projects page, okay? So that's whenever I say route or endpoint, that's what I mean. It's just that bit that comes after the actual like URL. That's the / whatever you're trying to get to, okay? Sound good? Cool. So Next.js actually makes it super duper easy to create different routes in this framework. So in Next, there is this source/app folder here. And this is where we put our actual pages, okay? So let's say I wanted to create an about page at the route /about. In Next.js, all I have to do is create a folder in this app folder called about. And then inside of this folder, I put a file called page.tsx. And this is just going to be a React component or like a React file. So you can just define a function that's a React component, and then that's what gets displayed on the page. So I'll just do that real quick right now. I'll say export default function page. And then I'll just return nothing for now. Return null for now. Okay. And so if I now run my dev server using npm run dev, we can go to the domain, the URL it says right here, this http://localhost:3000. And in this project, we just have a placeholder homepage. So when this loads, you'll see, yep, we have the homepage. And now if I go to the /about page, you can see we don't get a 404. The page is there. If I tried to go to like about with 2 T's, it'd be like, hey, that page doesn't exist, 404, right? So the about page exists, and whatever I put in this component is what gets displayed on the page. So I'll go ahead and show you guys that right now. I'll say like h1 about page. And you can see that on the page now we have whatever I just wrote. Okay? Cool. So that's awesome, super powerful, super easy, but we can also create routes that are dynamic, right? What does that mean? This means that we can put whatever we want for like this part of the route, for the like /about. We can put whatever we want. And then inside of our page, we can use that. Okay, so to show this off, I'm going to create another folder in the app folder, and I'll call this one open square bracket dynamic close square bracket. Okay. Surrounding the name of your folder in brackets tells Next that this is a dynamic route. Okay. So next I'm going to paste in some code here that will display whatever we put for the route onto the page. Okay. So if I go ahead and copy this and I create that new file called page.tsx, paste this in, and I now go to any route in my website. Where am I? Oh my goodness. Okay. And I now go to I can go to Xavier actually. We'll see that on the page, once it renders, is Xavier. I can go to Andrew. I can go to gibberish. And we'll see whatever I put there is actually getting displayed on the page, right? So if we take a quick look at this code, the page component has a prop that takes in the dynamic part. So notice that what we are rendering here, that what we're like displaying on the page here is called params.dynamic. This dynamic matches the name that we put inside of these square brackets, right? So whatever is in these brackets is going to be the name of the variable we use, right? So let's take a look at this in action. So if I rename, oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, any questions about path-based routing? Well, quick first recap. In order to create a page/route in Next.js, you'll create a folder in the app folder with whatever you want your route name to be. So we called our folder about, and then the corresponding route is /about. Then you can put a file in there that renders some React, and that's what gets displayed when you visit your route. And if you need dynamic routes, you can do that with square brackets. And then whatever is in between your square brackets is going to be the name of the variable you use when you're trying to like put it on the page or something. Okay? Any questions about path-based routing or dynamic routes or anything like that? No? Is it making sense? Okay. Fantastic. Okay, so armed with that knowledge, let's now write an API endpoint for creating a volunteer. Creating an API endpoint in the app folder is a little different than creating a page. So first of all, at Hack for Impact, all of our API endpoint routes, or all of our API endpoints / routes start with /API. You'll see we already have a folder in our, I'm actually going to delete these two example pages here. But you'll see we actually have a folder in our app folder called API. And so inside of this folder, we can create another folder, and we'll call that one volunteers. Oh, wait. Yeah, I've already got the volunteers folder. Okay. So that just means that we're creating the route /API/volunteers. So you see how I can kind of like go multiple layers deep? Like I have an API folder, and then inside that API folder, I have a volunteers folder. And so the corresponding route is going to be /API/volunteers. Okay. Now, instead of displaying a page to the user, we will want to write code that can actually just handle the request. So to do this, instead of creating a page.tsx file, we'll create a route.ts file. So I'll say new file. Oh, well, I got to do that in the volunteers. New file route.ts. Okay. So inside of this file, we can create an async function. So I'll say export async function, and that function is going to be called post. So having a function in this file called post tells Next.js that whenever we make a post request to this route, to /API/volunteers, this function should be run, right? So if you remember from last week, we talked about the different HTTP request methods. Post is the request method that is used when creating some data, right? This function actually takes a single argument, and it's going to be called rec or request. I'll call it request for example here. And the type of that is going to be something called a next request. So I'm going to just start typing that, and I'll get the autocomplete, hit enter, it'll import it for me. Okay. This type is something that Next.js gives us that represents the request to our API. So it'll have like all the information about the request that was made to this API route. Okay. A post request is pretty much always going to have some data in it, right? In this case, especially, it's going to contain information about the volunteer that about the volunteer that we're trying to create, right? So we'll need to get that data out of the request, and we can do this by writing the line const data equals request dot JSON. And I actually need to await that because that is also an asynchronous function. Okay. This line is basically saying, give me the JSON data from this request, please. Okay. Next, we'll use this data and pass it to that create volunteer function we created. So we'll say await create volunteer data. And that's pretty much it, right? There is one problem with this. We actually need to return a response. You remember last week we talked about how you make a request to the server responds back with a response. We actually need to respond back with a response. So we'll go ahead and do that by writing this line here, return next response, which is just like a response, dot JSON, and then we can return some JSON. So I'll just say success true, and then I'll give it a status code of 201. Okay. So what this line is saying right here is this is saying, okay, so we just got the request. We're going to create our volunteer, or what this function is saying, we just got our request. We're going to get the data from that request. We're going to use it to create a volunteer in our database. Then we are going to respond back to that request saying, hey, that was successful. You're good to go.
And on the response, we pass in two pieces of information here. The first is an object that has a property called success with the value true. That can be any object we want. And then the second thing we're giving is a status code, which basically tells the client what happened. There's like successful ones, failure ones, like if you are trying to find something and it's not in the database, if you're trying to create something but it already exists, things like that. A 201 indicates you asked me to create something in the database and I made something in the database. So I give you a 201 back. It just indicates success.
Yeah. All right. So that's all we really need to do. This one's kind of hard to test. But so to show that this actually works, that this concept actually works, I'm going to copy and paste another function in here that is a GET request. So as opposed to a POST request, a GET request is just going to get back some data from the database. And so what we're doing here is we're saying get all of my volunteers and then return a response that contains all those volunteers. And then we can actually go to the server. I'll save this file. We can actually go to the server. And in here, I will go to that /API/volunteers route. And when I do that, you'll see that we get back all of our data from the database. So I can print this out. You see we have all of our volunteers in here, right? So this is an actual working API route. And the post one works too. We'll see that in action when we actually hook it up to a React app or our React app, okay? Any questions about this API layer and like, you know, how it works with the server functions or like how requests work, anything about this, anything we've just gone over? Okay, is it kind of making sense? Okay, sweet. So to recap what we've just done, we created a folder for our API endpoint /route. And then in that folder, what is this? Oh, and then in that folder, we created a route.ts file. And then in this file, we've created a function called post, which tells Next.js that we are going to handle post requests to /API/volunteers using this code. Then we get the data from this request right here. We pass it along to the server action, the server function, and then finally return a response that says, hey, you're good. Nice. And then we also wrote this get function that's just going to get all of our volunteers from the database and return them from the server. Okay. So that's all the server stuff completely done. So if we take a look back at the diagram here, this line kind of represents the backend. The whole backend is done. You're all officially backend developers. Congratulations. So let's go ahead and turn you into full stack devs by creating some pages for the user to see. Before we do that, we need to explain something called client and server components and talk about the distinction and why it's important. So I'm gonna pass it off to Andrew here, and he's gonna talk about that for you.
Alrighty. So previously, we've looked at a React component. It's just a bit of code that translates into something visual on the page, and we can reuse those whenever we want. Now we're going to learn about two different kinds of components, client components and server components. This topic is something that's specific to Next and React. It's not necessarily a universal programming topic. It's more just a pattern that our framework uses. So client components and server components. The difference between the two is simply put, client components render the page on the client, your computer, and the server components render the page on the server, or whatever machine is running or hosting the application, and then send it to the client. So let's dig into that just a bit. Let's say, for example, that your friend has a spreadsheet that has a lot of data in it. I'm talking 19,000 gigabytes. It's a big spreadsheet. Your friend makes some graphs about the data, gets some excellent insights, and now you want to get the same insights that your friend did from the data, and you want to see those graphs. I personally can relate to this. So for the sake of this example, let's say we're communicating online. I'm going to pull up a quick, oh no, I hope this works. Yes. Okay, going to pull up a quick diagram. I did it all on my own this time.
Go.
Now, content. Okay, can you
Hit control.
control? Okay, I know how to use computers. I just get scared when I use this one. Oh, this is my old example. It's okay. It's just labeled. Let's see. So to get those graphs and see those graphs and get all those insights from the data, you can do that in one of two ways. You could, the first way you could do is this, which I have right here. Where's the mouse? There it is. So this is me. This is the friend. I could ask my friend, hey, how did you make those graphs? And then my friend will give me back the program that they used to make the graphs and said, I ran this code on the data set. That's all fine and well, but in order to actually make the graphs yourself, you need the data set so you can run the program on it. So then you have to ask your friend again, oh, can I have that data set? And then your friend says, yeah, here you can have the data set. They give you back the data set, and then you can run the program that they gave you before with this data set to actually create the graphs on your end. That's kind of ugly. There's a lot of steps to do something that should be pretty simple. Say, hey, how did you make the graphs? I ran this program on a file. Can I have the file? Yes, here's the file. Then you can run the program. So there is another way you can do this. The second way, which I personally think is a lot simpler, let me know what you think, but you can just ask your friend for the graphs, and they give them to you. In this instance, we know that your friend already has the data set and the program needed to make the graphs, but all we care about is the end result of the two, the graphs. So instead of doing this back and forth to get the program, then get the data, and then run the program to get the graphs, I can just get the graphs from my friend directly, two-step process. Since my friend already has the tools needed to make the graphs, they can just do it a lot faster than if they were to send me those tools. Where was that? So in this case, my friend doesn't have to transmit near as much data. In this example, he's basically sending me a screenshot, the graphs, instead of this 19,000 gigabyte file. So that's pretty neat. Sorry. So these are two methods that have the same result, but they operate just a little bit differently. Are there any questions I can answer about the premise of the situation and how these two examples work and how they are different? All right, moving on. This is just like my little example last week with the waiters that translates over to our actual application. So this analogy translates over to the difference between client and server components. The first example I went over is kind of how a client component operates. At a high level, when you're running the application and like logging onto a website, the client asks the server, hey, how do I make and display the page? What do I put on my screen? And then the server gives the client the code needed to run, to actually render that page. So it says here, run this TypeScript code with some data, and then that's what you need. So part of the code says, hey, get some data from the database to actually display on the page. So now the client has to go back and ask the server, hey, can I have that data? The server will get it from MongoDB and give it back. And now the client has everything it needs to actually render and display the content on the page. That is the code to run the page and the data that needs to go on the page. Any questions about this process? Just how do I display the page? Here's some code. You need some data. Can I have the data? Here's the data. And then you render it using all of those. So the second example I went over is this one right here. Is pretty close to how a server component operates. The client will ask the server, hey, can you render the page? The server gets all the data it needs, renders the page on the server using the code that's already on the server, and gives the quote unquote finished product to the client, and then the client just displays it. So just like our friend could make the graphs on their end and then just give the graphs to me, there's no need to send all of this extra code and data across the internet if they could just give me a finished, rendered, ready-to-go page that I can just display. So that kind of makes it sound like server components are just better. They're faster because we don't have to make as many requests back and forth between the client and the server, and there's far less data transferred between them across the internet. And because of this, any component you make is by default a server component in Next. There is, however, one situation in which we have to use client components, and that's whenever we have something that is interactive. Buttons, text fields, links, anyone that like a user could interact with. So the reason why interactive components need to be client components is because our TypeScript code is what defines what happens whenever we actually interact with something. In our lesson on React and MUI, we saw code where we wrote a function that ran every time we changed the value in a text field or every time we clicked a button. This is code that's written in TypeScript, so that code has to be able to run on the client for it to be able to work. Stuff that's rendered on the server isn't displayed to a user. It's still on the server over here. This is where your users are. So you can't put things on the server like buttons. So because of that, the server has to send over that TypeScript code to the client. And again, you can think of a server component as basically sending a screenshot of what the page looks like, whereas client components actually make the page themselves on the client. Because getting data from the database is much slower in client components because there's all that extra back and forth, as we saw earlier, we generally try to avoid the need to get data from the database in a client component. So our workflow looks something kind of like this, where the client asks how to make and display the page, and the server will just say, run this code. And this is just say, run this code, not with some data. No data. So inside of this code says, this is what happens if a user clicks this button. This is what happens if a user types in this field. Anything that's interactive is going to be inside of this code. Any questions I can answer about these three examples? This is a client component. This is a server component. This is a client component, but generally how we use them without any extra data from the database. All right. Hit the add there, Xavier. All right. Pull up this image. I have an example page I found online that we can look at. One last thing to note is that like in our application, we can have some components be server components and some components be client components. They don't all have to be one or the other. So let's say, for example, we have this page that I found online. If we were to kind of make this ourselves in React with client and server components, we would probably have one server component that contained the entire page. It has everything you see here. And then we have a client component inside of the server component that contains this toolbar with all of the clickable links, which are interactive. We probably have another client component that contains this contact form, which has interactive text boxes and buttons and things like that. And then we might have a server component that contains all of this information here, which doesn't change and it's not interactive at all. So the thing I really want to emphasize here is that there's a server component that contains kind of inner components, some of which can be client components. When we have a setup like this, the kind of static and unchanging data on the page, like this logo, this phone number, all of this information here, it can be rendered on the server quickly and sent over to the client and displayed almost instantly. And then the interactive parts in the client components, so this form and these buttons, they can be rendered on the page as soon as they're ready. Because again, the client has to say, give me the code I need to run these. Server gives the code, then the client sets up the code and runs it. That takes time. So to recap, there's two types of components. There's client components and there's server components. Client components ask the server how to render the page, and the server sends back code telling it how. And that code runs on the client. If I'm in Google, it runs on Google Chrome. Server components run code on the server, render the page on the server, and then send the finished result to the client where it's displayed, kind of like a screenshot of the page. Because of this setup, we use client components whenever there's any kind of interactivity, and server components whenever we need to get data from the database or the content on a page isn't changing. So in a real application, we really oftentimes have client components that are inside of server components. Any questions about client versus server components? Why we use either, when we use either?
Would you need to use a client component if you're like worried that your server will be like overwhelmed with the amount of stuff that it's running, or is that a problem ever?
No. In short, no.
Yeah, your client is going to be much less powerful than your server generally.
I'll say we have never looked at that case. So
Yeah.
Awesome.
On to you.
Thanks, Andrew. That analogy was amazing. I understand it better, that's for sure. Okay. So why did we spend time talking about that? The reason is because all of our pages, those page.tsx files, are going to be server components. Okay? This lets them get data from the database using those server functions that we wrote directly. However, we still want to be able to interact with the page, right? So how can we do this? At Hack for Impact, we use something that we call the view pattern. The main idea is to keep the pages as server components, but then we have special view components that contain all the stuff we would normally put on our page, and those components can be interactive, right? Then this lets us get our data from the database quickly while still having interactivity. It just separates the two. So let's take a quick look at how we can do this by creating a route for our volunteer list page. So first, in order to do that, we'll need to come back to this app folder. And inside here, we'll create a new folder called volunteers. Then inside of here, just like before, we're going to create a new file called page.tsx. And then in here, we can actually create the component. So I'll go ahead and do that. Export default. And notably, I'm going to make this an async function for the component. And I'm going to call this volunteers page. Okay. Now, since this is a server component, we can directly call our get all volunteers function that we wrote and assign that to a variable inside of this component. So I'll say const volunteers equals get all volunteers. And I need to await that because it is an asynchronous function. Okay. So yeah, so this is going to run on the server. This component is going to be built on the server. Then it'll be sent over to the client. So let's go ahead and make the component that is going to be run on the client, the view component. So to do this, we'll create a new folder inside of source/views. So I'll close this app folder. See at the bottom we have source/views. I'll create a new folder in here, and I'll call that volunteers view. It's already there. Thanks, Git. And then inside of this folder, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm just going to call that index.tsx. TSX, it's going to be a React component. Inside this file now is going to be where we actually put the code to display our volunteers. Now, this is going to be a client component. It's going to have interactivity on it. So what we need to do to tell Next that this is going to be a client component is at the top, we just put a string that says use client. And that's it. Now Next.js knows, hey, don't render this on the server, send it over to the client, and then the client can render it, right? For the sake of time, I'm just going to copy and paste in a component. And then we will see that in action. So I'm going to copy that in. And now, then in our page.tsx file, so we have this component, we have this volunteers view component. In our page, in our volunteers page component, we can actually just display this volunteers view component. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll say return. And inside here, I'll say volunteers view. And if we look at this volunteers view component, you'll see it is expecting a prop. And that prop is going to be a list of volunteers. Okay. So usually what the pattern is we'll have a page, and the page will call some sort of server function. It'll get data from a server function. Then we'll have a view that's expecting that data as a prop. Then we put the view on the page and we pass in the data as that prop, right? So right here, we need to say the volunteers prop is going to be equal to that volunteers variable. Okay, and I need to import that. Okay. Awesome. So our server is running. So let's go ahead and see this in action. Go ahead and open up my server, localhost 3000. We have a nice link right here to the volunteers page. So let's go ahead and click that. It's going to take us to /volunteers. It'll have to render. Nice. You'll see that we have data from our server, and it's displayed in this really nice looking list. So this is all the data from our database, and we just have displayed it in this list. I'll go ahead and zoom in on this a little bit. All the data from the server in this nice little list. And you see this view has a button on it. It's interactive, right? That's why we needed to make this view, because we have this button here that I can click on in order to go to a page to create a new volunteer. Let's go ahead and try that out. And we'll see, it's like, oh, 404. I need to actually make that page. Oh, crap. Okay, let's do it. So let's go ahead and do that right now. In order to do this, we'll do pretty much the exact same process. We're going to make the route here, /volunteers/new. So to do that, inside of this volunteers folder, we'll create a new folder, call that new. And then inside of this folder, this new folder, we will create a new file, page.tsx. And we can go ahead and write that component function, export default function new volunteer page. And I need to make this async. And in here again, we can, we actually don't need to make a database call here, right? Because we're not actually getting anything from the database. So all we'll have to do is display our view. So we'll do that in 1 second. So let's go ahead and make the view. It's going to be in this views/new volunteer view folder. We'll create a new file, call that index.tsx. And again, for the sake of time, I'm going to just copy and paste some code. Sorry. Okay. So now, yeah, that's fine. So now Where am I? Okay. We can click this add volunteer button. Oh, well, I forgot to actually display the view in the page. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll say, okay, we want to display the new volunteer view. And again, that's not going to have any props. So we just pass it like that. Now, if I refresh this, okay, yep, you'll see we have our form on the page. So we can now go between the volunteers page and the add volunteer page. And let's go ahead and fill this form out. So Xavier Miller, Xavier at fake.com, 11122233334, and 1234 adder drive. Okay. And let's see if this works. So let's go ahead and try to submit it. Gadzooks! It doesn't work. Nothing happened. I guess we forgot to implement the submit functionality so that we will actually hit our API and create the volunteer. So let's go ahead and do that now. If we look in our new volunteer view component, you'll see we already have a function here called handle submit. But all it's doing right now is just console logging the data. So we actually need to make this work. And in order to make this work, we need to actually reach out over the internet to our API, say, hey, API, I want to create a new volunteer. Here's the data. The API will be like, great, let's do it. So let's go ahead and make that work. In order to do this, we are going to use this function called fetch that is just provided by TypeScript. Every TypeScript runtime has this fetch function. So I can go ahead and type await fetch because it is asynchronous, right? It has to reach out over the internet. It's going to take some time. So we say await fetch. Then we give it the route we want to hit. If you remember that create volunteer API endpoint was at /API/volunteers. And then we can give it some options. So we do for the next parameter, we'll create an object, and this will contain all of our options. Okay. So first, we need to tell it what request method this is going to be, because by default, fetch is going to make it a GET request. We don't want that. We want a POST request. So to do that, all we have to do is say method POST, right? Then we just need to tell it what data to pass along. And so in order to do that, we'll say body. So the request body, this is the data that is going to be passed in with the request. And you see we have this data variable here that's passed into this function. So we will just pass that data along. And in order to do that, first we need this body to be a string. It can't be an object. Right now it's like this create volunteer request, right? So it's like an object with the first name, last name, email. We need it to be a string. But we still want it to be to have all that data. So what we can do is use another JavaScript function called json.stringify. And that will just turn an object into a string so that you can pass it over the internet. Okay? Then after we do that, so this is the call that is actually going to be reaching out, hitting our API and creating the volunteer. After we do that, we'll want to redirect the user to the list page so that they can see their newly created volunteer in the list. So in order to do that, I have this router variable up here. I'm going to say router.push, which is just saying, hey, redirect me to this new place. And I'm going to redirect to the /volunteers route. And again, that /volunteers route, that's just going to be the list of all of our volunteers. And then I also need to add this one line right here called router.refresh. Don't worry about what that's doing. Just know anytime you push after you like make some data, you'll need to call that. And then we can now go ahead and try this out again. So let's go ahead and just submit this same thing. Okay, it redirected us. And if we scroll all the way down, whoa, there I am. Xavier Miller, Xavier at fake.com. That's amazing. We can see them in the list. It works. We have like built a volunteer management system pretty much, right? So to recap everything that we've gone over today. 1, we thought out the problem and determined a solid database schema. Step 1. Once we had that, we implemented the schema and built some server functions to actually interact with our database. After we did that, we implemented an API endpoint that our front end can hit to create a new volunteer. Then we used the view pattern to display data in the front end and hooked it all up to the back end so that it all worked together. Okay? Any questions about anything we've gone over today? Sweet. How you guys feeling about this? Okay, cool. So that's a fully working application. Pretty neat, right? This general process of thinking out a problem, implementing a schema, creating API endpoints, and then putting it on the front end, this is something we do over and over at Hack for Impact. So this is super valuable. That's all for this week, but we haven't done any sort of validation yet in this application to ensure users can't supply bad data. So right now, there's nothing stopping me from coming in here and just submitting a first name and nothing else. And it just doesn't work, right? And our users might be confused by that. They're like, I put it in, I click submit, it looks like it does what it normally does when it works, but I don't see the volunteer in here. Why didn't it work? So we need to add validation to ensure that they can't do stuff like that and give the users helpful feedback. So that's actually what we'll be going over next week. If there are no questions, you guys are good to go. Thanks for coming. I'll see you guys next week.
If you weren't able to attend the volunteering this past Saturday, I'm probably going again this Saturday. It'll be a smaller group.